50th. It's generally thought that these two were written approximately the same time, maybe 700 and some years before Christ, just before the northern kingdom had gone into captivity, and when there was a good deal of prosperity in the southern kingdom, particularly. And the 49th Psalm begins with an introduction. In other words, he's going to tell you what he's going to say before he says it. And so we read those first 4 verses. Psalm 49, Hear this, all ye peoples, give ear, all ye inhabitants of the world, both low and high, rich and poor together. My mouth shall speak of wisdom, and the meditation of my heart shall be of understanding. I will incline mine ear to a parable. I will open my dark saying upon the heart. Now first, you notice he wants the ear of every single human being. He says, I'm going to speak to everybody, whether he's Jew, whether he's Gentile, whether he's of low birth, whether he's of high birth, whether he's rich or poor. And he says, what I'm going to say will be wisdom. And he says, I'm not saying it off of the top of my head. I'm not just saying something to be heard. It's the result of deep meditation, and you can be sure that it will be with understanding. Now, one of the psalmists has said that the beginning of wisdom is the fear of the Lord, and in the Proverbs we have both the beginning of wisdom and the beginning of knowledge is the fear of the Lord. And this psalmist mentions the matter of understanding, and he also mentions wisdom. I wonder if you've ever considered just what is the difference between understanding and wisdom, or what is the difference among the 3 terms, that is to say, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. If you read the first several chapters of Proverbs, you'll see that these 3 items are extolled by the writer, knowledge and understanding and wisdom. They're better understood if they're put in that order. If you put them in order, knowledge, understanding, and wisdom. Someone has said, knowledge is the orderly assimilation of facts by the intellect. My mind organizes a set of facts, and then I have knowledge. I gain that through intellect. Knowledge is more than just facts. You could have all kind of facts, and it wouldn't represent knowledge unless it was an orderly assimilation of facts. So that's knowledge. Then understanding is the comprehension of those facts, or the comprehension of knowledge by the reason. In other words, it's through your intellect that you acquire knowledge, but understanding comes through your reasoning power. And at that time, when you have understanding, the knowledge is usable. Until it's understood, it's not usable. It may be assimilated in your mind in an orderly manner. You may have these facts in your mind. Your intellect has grasped them, but you don't have understanding. For instance, if you were studying a foreign language, you may have all of the grammar, all the details, and so forth, but if you don't have a good comprehension, then you don't have that language ready for utilization. So we could say knowledge is the orderly assimilation of facts by the intellect, and we could say understanding is the comprehension of that knowledge by the reason, having it ready for use. Then wisdom is the judicious utilization of knowledge. So I gain the knowledge, I acquire the knowledge, and through my reason, I gain understanding by which I make that knowledge usable. And then wisdom is the putting of that knowledge into use judiciously. it's possible to use knowledge unwisely, isn't it? Yes. So wisdom is the judicious use of knowledge. So our psalmist here says that what he is going to say is wisdom. He says, I have taken facts and I have assimilated them. And he says, I have come, through meditation, I have come to a comprehension of what that knowledge means and how it can be used. Now it's ready for use, and I'm going to use that knowledge judiciously. So I'm going to be speaking wisdom. That's what he's saying. In verse 4, I will incline my ear to a parable. I will open my dark sayings upon the harp. He says, I'm going to sing a song. I'm going to accompany it with a harp. And he said, I'm going to put these words that I want to say to music. And he says it's going to be somewhat in the form of a riddle, or even better, this dark saying is an enigma. That is, how do you resolve the situation? How do you understand? It's going to be something that's difficult for man to comprehend and understand, that which I'm going to talk about. And then he's going to dwell upon a rather favorite subject of man, and particularly in the Bible. And that is this: why does the wealthy prosper, even though he's wicked? In other words, in a God that was begun, in a world that was begun by a holy God, how can it be that wickedness accompanied by wealth has gained favor? And he says, this is what I've been meditating about, and this is what I want to expound upon, because it's a question for many. You know, that's the subject matter of the whole book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk was perplexed. He wanted to know from God why there was so much wickedness around him in among a people that were the people of a holy God. And since there was that wickedness among this special people, how could a holy God countenance prosperity on the part of those people? How could that be justified? That's an enigma. It's a riddle. And this is the riddle to which this man addresses himself. Now, there's another psalm that presents the problem that this psalmist is discussing. The psalm that presents the problem is Psalm 73, a psalm of Asaph. And he's very perplexed about this matter. But this psalmist has already thought it through, and he has the answer. He's not going to present the problem so much. He says it is a problem. I want to recognize it. But he says now, through wisdom, I'm going to unfold the answer to this seeming problem. So his answer begins in verse 5. Wherefore should I fear in the days of evil, when the iniquity of my heels shall compass me about? Now that's a strange wording there, but that's not the riddle. Actually, this heel would come from an old expression. It means somebody who treads me down, or it's someone who places his heel on me. Or we use this today, he's a heel, you know. He oppresses. He puts his heel on somebody and oppresses them. So we might read this, when the iniquity of my supplanters, when the iniquity of my treaders down shall compass me about. They that trust in their wealth and boast themselves in the multitude of their riches. He says, now it seems to me, as I observe, that wealth gives power. And someone who has enough wealth can tread upon whomsoever he chooses to tread upon, if he wants to. And then in verse 7 it says, none of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him. There was one rich man that almost tried this. Remember in the 16th chapter of Luke, the rich man that went to Hades, and he wanted his voice to be heard that he might have a part in the redemption of his 5 brothers. But he wasn't able even to contribute towards that, was he, in the story there? And so he says, the psalmist is saying he's answering the question by asking the question. He says, all right, as you look around, and it seems to be that the wealthy have an advantage, I'll ask you a question. Can such a one redeem his brother? Can such a one give God a ransom? Now, if someone were to capture, if the thieves were to capture the child of a wealthy man and demand a ransom, if he was wealthy enough, he could ransom that child. And the word brother here means any of his kin. So someone steals his kin. Can he redeem him? Yes, if he has enough wealth. Well, suppose God lays claim to that relative. Does he have the ransom price? Can he redeem his brother? He says. He's putting the thing in a different perspective. It may look like he's got a lot of weight and that he can manifest himself as he wants to, but when it comes right down to very important things, what can he really do about it? Now, the 8th verse is parenthetic. So we're going to read it, and then we'll go back and read 7 and 9 together. This is just a comment on this matter of ransoming his brother. In verse 8, for the redemption of their soul is precious, that is to say, costly, and it ceaseth forever. That is the attempt. It'll fail, and it'll be an everlasting failing. That's what he's saying. He's saying that the value and the cost of a soul is more than money can buy. There's not enough money for one soul. And he says, so it'll always be that way. It'll always fail. That's parenthetic, explaining something about the value of a soul. Now, we want to go back and read again verse 7 and 9, leaving out the parenthetical 8th verse. None of them can by any means redeem his brother, nor give to God a ransom for him, that he should still live forever and not see corruption. Now, here's what he's saying. Here is a very wealthy man, and he has some kinfolk, and he doesn't want that kin person to go to the grave. It's come time for him to die. God has decided to take what is his, and so now the wealthy man wants to pay the ransom price. He wants to continue to keep the relative out of the grave so that he won't see corruption. Now, can he do this? Is he able to do this with all of his wealth? Now, you see, the psalmist has put this enigma in proper perspective for us by saying, you look around and it looks like a wealthy person has much power. But he's not God, is he? Because here's something he can't do. And now that he's got our attention along the lines and got the whole problem in perspective, he can reason with us. In verse 10, for he sees that wise men die. Likewise, the fool, whether he's a fool, and the brutish person perishes and leaves their wealth to others. It shouldn't take any insight at all for a wealthy man or anybody that is observing a wealthy man. Realize now this psalm is to everybody. He wants everybody to look at the situation. He wants the poor man that doesn't have the wealth to look at it, and he wants the wealthy man to look at it. He wants the man of high degree and low degree, because what he's going to say is going to put everybody on the same level, really. And he says, whoever it is, and however wealthy he is, whether he has any money, whether he's wise, whether he's a fool, whatever wealth he leaves, he's going to leave it to others. He's not going to be able to keep it. So see, he's putting it in perspective again. Number one, he's saying there's some things that wealth can't do. Then he's saying it's for sure that it's going to be left behind. Those are two things that speak against the value of wealth. There's some things that wealth simply will not do. And there is a time when wealth must be released and left to someone else. Those are two disadvantages in wealth. So it shouldn't be quite so highly regarded as some would regard it. Verse 11, their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call their lands after their own names. What the psalmist is saying here, he's pointing out a propensity. See, he's thought this thing through, and he says, now, man can by observation gain easily the insight to know that he's got to leave his wealth to somebody else, that he's not going to live forever, and also that if it comes time for one of his relatives to die, he can't redeem that one. And so he has some inward thoughts about this, and he has some ways of trying to make up the difference. And one of those things is to name things after himself and to try to gain some measure of immortality that way. Now, man has been doing that ever since man sinned. Look way back in Genesis chapter 4. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 16, and Cain went out from the presence of the Lord and dwelt in the land of Nod on the east of Eden. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Now, that's not the Enoch that was the seventh from Adam that was translated, of course. There's two Enochs, one in the 4th chapter of Genesis and one in the 5th chapter, and they are not the same personage. One is a descendant of Cain, and the other is a descendant of Seth. So let's not get the two mixed up. This is the, so to speak, bad Enoch. The other one's the good Enoch. So in Genesis 4:17, and Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch, and he builded a city, and called the name of the city after the name of his son Enoch. Now, he thought, I can gain some measure of continuing recognition. Now, man's been doing that ever since, and that's what this fella thought about. I don't know how many of you know the history of this, but back in the 1830s, there was a college founded in the city of Durham, North Carolina. And the founders of that college were church people. They were individuals in one of the larger denominations in the country. And they wanted to establish something enduring. And they named the college Trinity College. And the purpose of it was to teach spiritual principles to young men and train pastors and so forth. And that college progressed along at a rather slow rate for many, many years. And then in 1924, after that college had been going for 80-some years, a very wealthy resident of the city of Durham died. And his name was Duke. And, of course, he was the heir of a great tobacco fortune. And his people wanted his name to live. And they said, well, I suppose about the best way his name could live is for an established institution of higher learning to be named for him. And so they didn't want to start a new college and name it for him because, you know, sometimes new colleges didn't go. So they wanted one that had a good long record of stability, And so this one, Trinity College, had been operating for 80-some years and had all the earmarks of going on for longer than most human beings live. So the family says, we'll give you $40 million if you'll change your name to Duke instead of Trinity. And they said, well, that's a good deal. Now, $40 million is pretty much now, isn't it? But $40 million back then was even more, wasn't it? But their purpose was they wanted to perpetuate a name, because the reaper had come, and it became very, very evident that he wasn't around anymore to hold on to the wealth. So they wanted to take a portion of his wealth. And so here, this college, it was founded for spiritual purposes and so forth, and named after the triune God, had its name changed so that it was henceforth and forevermore named after a tobacco tycoon, and it still bears that name. And it's still a religious school, and has a divinity school connected with it and so forth. There's another little town just north of Durham called Wake Forest, and they had a college there named Wake Forest College that was organized by some spiritually minded people of a different larger denomination. And another tobacco tycoon decided he wanted to do the same thing, and somehow or another the people of that college were smart enough to outsmart them. They did move the college to Winston-Salem and accept the grant from the tobacco fortunes, but it's still, I think, called Wake Forest College, even though it's in Winston-Salem now instead of Wake Forest. But the point is, men try every way to perpetuate themselves. Vanderbilt University, for instance, was named that to perpetuate a name. And just go down the line, you see cities, countries, institutions, what have you. Man wants to perpetuate his name. Now, so they build cities and name themselves for them, or name them for themselves, or build institutions. Now, Abraham wasn't like that. You see, Cain, through his son, builded a city so he could make himself a name. But Abraham trusted God. See, God promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 a little different. Well, you know, these fellows that wanted to build this Tower of Babel. You see, in Genesis 11, verse 4, and they said, go to, let us build us a city and a tower whose top may reach unto the heaven. For what purpose did they want to build that? There it is. And let us make us a name. Now look over the next chapter, verse 12. And chapter 12, verse 1. Now the Lord said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country, and from thy kindred, and from thy father's house, unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great. Now you see, these men at Babel, they wanted to make themselves a great name, and now God's going to make somebody, Abraham, a great name. And if you read the comment on Abraham's reaction to this, you can find it in Hebrews chapter 11. When Abraham became very, very wealthy on this earth, he refused to build himself a house. And we're told in Hebrews chapter 11 why he wouldn't build a house. He never built a city, we're told, because why wouldn't he build a city? Because he looked for a city whose maker and builder was God. That's why. He was waiting for. He was looking for. He didn't want a city. He wanted the city that God was going to make. And he didn't want a name. He wanted the name, and God gave him a name. The father of nations, didn't he? The name Abraham. Anyway, Abraham said always, he raised his son and his grandsons in tents, we're told. He always lived in tents because he wanted to show something. What he wanted to show? He wanted to show that he was a stranger and a pilgrim on this earth, no matter how much of this earthly goods he had, and he had more than anybody else did in his day. But he wanted to show that he knew that here he had no continuing city, but he sought one to come. Now all of that comment is on that section concerning Abraham in Hebrews chapter 11, if you'd like to read it. But back to our psalm again, verse 11. Their inward thought is that their houses shall continue forever, and their dwelling places to all generations. They call their lands after their own names. Nevertheless, man, being in honor, abideth not. He is like the beasts that perish. Now, there's a sense in which he's like the beast that perishes, in this matter of not being able to carry anything with him. He's going to go into this a little further as we go along. Verse 13, this their way is their folly, yet their prosperity approve of their sayings. Think of that. What he's saying is this. Their sons see the folly of their type of thinking and wisdom, and yet approve of it and follow right into it, and exalt him by going along with this matter of, it wasn't Mr. Duke himself that put out the $40 million. Now, I don't know, he might have put that in his will, but he wasn't the one that put out the dough. It was somebody that was following right along in his chain of thought. Verse 14, like sheep they are laid in the grave, or Sheol, that is. Death shall feed on them. One translation puts this, instead of death shall feed on them, death shall shepherd them. It's as though for a shepherd they had death, and the shepherd death was channeling them as a flock into the grave. See, this is a picture of all mankind, or anything that's born on this earth. If that's all from an observable standpoint, it's as though they had a shepherd that was shepherding every one of them down into Sheol. That's the picture he's giving here. And the upright shall have dominion over them in the morning. Now the psalmist is going to start now showing you the other side of this coin. He says, for the upright there's a morning. And the only thing that matters is who is on top in the morning. Do you ever think about this? When God measures time, it's always the evening and the morning. He puts the night first and the day next. Evening, in God's economy, is the prelude to the morning. Man does it the other way around. See, we start with the morning. That starts the day. For instance, it's dark now, but we don't call this Wednesday night, do we? No, it's Tuesday night. See, our economy is the daytime followed by the darkness. That's this world system. God's system is night is followed by the day. Though there be weeping at night, joy cometh in the morning. So, the psalmist says there's a difference, you see. For the upright, there's a morning. And in the morning, who's going to be on top? Their beauty shall consume in Sheol from their dwelling. Or, as some translators put it, they shall have no dwelling. They're going to be, but they're not going to have a dwelling. Now, he's going to show you what we have in contrast. Verse 15, but God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he shall receive me. Now, think of that. See, when he told the fate of the unsaved wealthy, he said, Selah. And then he's telling his end result. He says, but God will redeem my soul. See, I don't care how rich he is. He can't redeem anybody's soul, not his own or anybody else's. But God can. And God will. And my soul is one of the souls he's going to redeem. So who's better off? I don't care how wealthy he is and how poor I am. Who's better off? There's a man that meets me at Frostproof every Monday night. and rides down to Sebring with me to go to the Bible study there. And he just recently a rather gross misfortune that cost him around $12,000. And it was the result of how somebody who he'd trusted had misused him. And he was really having a rough time getting the victory. And he'd had quite a few. He had an airplane, and the nose wheel had collapsed and tore up his plane. He had several things that had really gone wrong. And so I said, do you suppose of all the people in the world, over 5% are truly saved? He says, I wouldn't think it was that many. And I says, but you are, aren't you? He said, yes. I said, well, at least you're in the top 5%, aren't you? When it comes to good fortune. Because I don't care how fortunate anybody is. If they're unsaved, they're worse off than you are. Well, he didn't say anything. I didn't say anything more. And he told me a couple of weeks later, he says, you know, that was the best thing in the world you could have ever said to me. he said, you know, I got to thinking about that. I have a wife and 4 lovely children. And he says, I'm saved. You know. So, you know, how can you be so bad off if you're better off than 98% of all the people in the world? That gives you a good head start, doesn't it? So that's what the psalmist is bringing out here. He says, God will redeem my soul from the power of Sheol, for he shall receive me. Be not thou afraid when one is made rich, when the glory of his house is increased. I mean, don't let, if you're afraid he's going to use that wealth against you, don't worry about it. For when he dies, he shall carry nothing away. His glory shall not descend after him. All of his greatness is not going to go with him. He's going to leave that behind. Though while he lives, he blessed his soul, and men will praise thee when thou doest well to thyself. He says, look, he says, when he was here, he blessed his soul, and that is to say, he really thought highly of himself. And he says, now, I want you to understand, men will praise you. If you're craving wealth, I'll assure you, men will praise you if you do well for yourself. You're just going to get some acclaim just because if you're a go-getter. You know, the Lord told a parable about a fellow that blessed his soul, didn't he? That's in Luke chapter 12. It's not a parable, I don't guess. I guess it's a true story. Let's see if he says it's a parable. If it's a parable, he says it's a parable. Yeah, he spake a parable, so it was a parable. Luke 12:16. And he spoke a parable unto them, saying, the ground of a certain rich man brought forth plentifully, and he thought within himself. That was his big mistake, wasn't it? Saying, what shall I do? Because I have no room where to bestow my fruits. And he said, this will I do. I will pull down my barns and build greater. And there I will bestow all my fruits and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, thou hast much goods. See, he was blessing his soul. Soul, thou hast much goods laid up for many years. Take thine ease, eat, drink, and be merry. But God said unto him, thou fool, this night thy soul shall be required of thee. Then whose shall all these things be which thou hast provided? This is the same subject. In other words, this eye that you see sticking straight up all through here is going to be laying flat down instead of sticking straight up. Huh? Yeah. See how upright that eye is? right up there. I. Well, it's going to be I, just like this. He had I-itis, didn't he? So he was blessing his soul. That's what he was doing. See verse 18 back in our psalm. Though while he lived, he blessed his soul, and men shall praise thee when thou dost well to thyself. He shall go to the generation of his fathers, and they shall never see light. Now this lets you know that the psalmist understands that the death is not the end, that the grave is not the end. He says that he's going to go where his fathers are, and that together they'll never see light. Somebody, I guess, has always wondered how hell can be a place of fire and of utter darkness, but the Bible teaches it's both. It speaks of everlasting chains of darkness. Now, there would have to be a total absence of light in hell, because God is light. And one of the things that could be said about hell is it's the absolute absence of everything godly. And God is light. All the light that any human being has ever had, of any kind, has been by the mercy of a God who is light. And all the light that any individual has, if he does not receive the light, that light will turn to darkness, eternal, abject, black darkness. And I suppose that's why on three occasions in the history of mankind, God has brought such darkness, or he will have brought such darkness upon the earth. Two of those times are past tense, and one is still future. For we have the story back in Exodus where there was such a abject darkness for 3 days that the people were anguished, and they couldn't even get up out of their beds. It was so oppressive. And then another time there was complete darkness at noonday on the face of the earth for 3 hours when Christ hung on Calvary's cross, and God turned out the light to show what sin does. And in the book of Revelation it tells of a time still future when the darkness will be so oppressive that men will gnaw their tongues in anguish. Now, that ought to be enough to make anybody want to miss hell, hadn't it? So he says, he shall go to the generation of his fathers, they shall never see light. What a pronouncement. I believe this psalmist is saying something that needs to be said, isn't he? He said, in verse 3, my mouth shall speak wisdom, and the meditation of my heart shall be of understanding. Verse 20, he says, man that is in honor and understandeth not is like the beast that perishes. What he's saying here is that a man that's honored here on this earth, like this individual with the 40 million, if he doesn't have understanding, if he hasn't taken some facts and assimilated them in an orderly manner and let his reasoning be exercised so that he has that knowledge available for use, well then he's, as far as this world's concerned, he's like a beast, and as far as eternity's concerned, he's worse off, isn't it, than a beast. Well, that's rather a deep thinker we've been involved with there. He's told you that he was going to speak wisdom, and he said that he was going to give you the results of his meditation. And it's wisdom that this world needs. Now in Psalm 50, the mighty God, even the Lord, hath spoken and called the earth from the rising of the sun unto the going down thereof. Now, this is a very interesting first verse. Actually, if we were reading a literal translation, instead of the mighty God, it would say the mighty one, God, or it would say Elyon, Elohim, Jehovah. Actually, the psalmist is beginning his psalm by calling God by three of God's names. The first one of those names is translated the mighty one, El, or Elyon. And then Elohim, which is God the Creator, God who is, God in all of his essence. And then Jehovah is God as he manifests himself to man. And the psalmist is starting his song here by invoking three names of God. This is very interesting. Now, this is done in a somewhat different order in other places in the Bible, but as far as I know, this is the only psalm that begins in such a way. And he says, such a one has spoken, and called the earth from the rising of the sun unto the going down thereof. Out of Zion, the perfection of beauty, God hath shined. Our God shall come. Now he says, God has come, and God shall come. And the coming of God that he's going to talk about is the coming of God in judgment, because the psalmist is going to tell about a complaint that God has against his people, or a series of complaints. And he says, God can't let this go. God must judge. Out of Zion, the perfections of beauty, God hath shined. That is, when he manifested himself to earth. See, the mighty one showed himself in the creation in all of his essence. Then he manifested himself to man. These names of God that we have here are progressive. He says he's shined. And this God shall come, and shall not keep silent. A fire shall devour before him, and it shall be very tempestuous round about him. Or what he's saying is, somebody's sinning, and God's going to do something about it. And it's not going to be just an ordinary, everyday little zephyr of a storm. It's really going to make a fuss when he comes. It's going to be very tempestuous when he comes in judgment. He shall call to the heavens from above and to the earth, that he may judge his people. In other words, he's going to have all of his creatures beholding, and he's going to judge his people. Gather my saints together unto me, those who have made a covenant with me by sacrifice. It says, those who are mine are going to be there. Those who've spoken against me are going to be there. And the heavens shall declare his righteousness, for God is judge himself. Think about that for a while. This great God in all of his manifestations is one day going to come upon the scene, and you're going to have to do with him. So then he says in verse 7, Hear, O my people, and I will speak, O Israel, and I will testify against thee, I am God, even thy God. Now the last psalm was very, very pointedly to every living member of the human race. This psalm is primarily to God's own people. And he says, God must judge. Now he's going to complain in two ways. He's going to complain against those who involve themselves in formalities of worship and think that they have done their due to God through formal worship. And then he's going to speak about hypocrisy. If you keep this in mind, there were 2 tables of stone upon which the 10 commandments were written. On one table were those commandments that had to do with sins against God. Most people think that was the first 4. it could have been the first 5, because the 5th one is honor your father and your mother, and that could be a picture of your relationship with God. But the last 5 of the 10 Commandments have to do with your relationship with your fellow human being. You know, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not commit adultery, and so forth. The tables, the commandments on one table of stone, or tablet of stone, had to do with your relationship with God. On the other, your relationship with your fellow human being. Now you remember, this matter came up when Christ was asked a question, or was accosted by one of his one of the dissenters just before his crucifixion, there in that final week of his upon the earth. And he pointed out that the 10 Commandments were really only 2 commandments. Let's look at that a moment. Hold your place here and look in Matthew chapter 22. You find this in the other 2 of the other Gospels, but let's look at it in Matthew. Matthew 22, verse 34. But when the Pharisees had heard that he had put the Sadducees to silence, they were gathered together. Then one of them, who was a lawyer, asked him a question, trying him, saying, Master, which is the great commandment in the law? And Jesus said unto him, Thou shalt love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. This is the first and great commandment. And the second is like it. Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. On these 2 commandments hang all the law and the prophets. This encompasses the whole thing. Man's duty towards God and his duty towards his fellow human being. And this would represent the 2 tables of stone on which the 10 Commandments. Now, the 10 Commandments are recorded, among other places, in Exodus chapter 20. And if you read down, you can see that all of the first ones have to do with, like, thou shalt have no other gods before me, you know, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It has to do with your relationship with God and the other's relationship to man. So, what he's going to show here is that man has turned, his own people, God's own people, have turned their proper regard for their God into just mere formality. And they have changed their regard, their debt of regard to their fellow human being to hypocrisy. And of course, these were the 2 sins of the Pharisees. That was outward formality. That's why he called them whited sepulchres. Only showed they were only white on the outside, full of dead men's bones, he said. And that's why he called them hypocrites. Because they didn't do towards their fellow human being what they purported to do. That's hypocrisy. And they didn't regard God in their hearts according to what their outward procedures would profess. So, back to our psalm, verse 7. Hear, O my people, and I will speak, O Israel, I will testify against thee. I am God, even thy God. I will not reprove thee for thy sacrifices or thy burnt offerings to have been continually before me. He says, I'm not going to chasten you, or I'm not going to speak harshly about any procedures that you might have done wrong. He says, I'm not going to talk to you because you didn't perform the sacrifices in the right manner. He says, I'm not going to talk about your procedures at all. He says, verse 9, I will take no bullock out of thy house, nor he-goat out of thy fold. That is to say, I don't really want your sacrifices on the basis that you've been given them. You've been given them as though you thought you were doing something for me. Verse 10, for every beast of the forest is mine, and the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the fowls of the mountains, and the wild beasts of the field are mine. If I were hungry, I wouldn't tell you, for the world is mine, and all the fullness thereof. Will I eat the flesh of bulls, or drink the blood of goats? He said, what do you think these sacrifices you're doing are all about? You're performing them as though to perform them, in the form of performing them, was what I enjoyed. As if I were hungry and I eat these animals. And he says, don't you know I'm God? And if I wanted something to eat, I wouldn't have to ask you for it. The cattle on 1,000 hills, of course, that 1,000 is figurative, as 1,000 is many times. It's 10 figuratively, emphatically. That is to say, when God wants to say, this is sufficient for every purpose. Anytime you see 10 used figuratively, I think if you'll just think in this terms, God is saying it's enough for any purpose. It's sufficient. And 1,000 is simply 10 to the third power. It's 10 cubed. 10 times 10 times 10. That's what 1,000 is. And it means the same thing as 10, but emphasized when it's used figuratively. It's like the millennium is going to be 1,000 years. I think it's going to be a literal 1,000 years. I think that the language dictates that. But still, it has a figurative connotation. Even though it's going to be a literal 1,000 years, there's a reason why it's going to be for 1,000 years. That's going to be sufficient to prove what God wants to prove. Emphatically, it's going to be sufficient. So God owns the cattle on 1,000 hills. Now, in verses 14 and 15, he's going to tell them what he really wants. He says, offer unto God thanksgiving, and pay thy vows unto the Most High, and call upon me in the day of trouble, and I will deliver thee, and thou shalt glorify me. He says, all I really want is your thankfulness, and I want you to call upon me. When the prophet Isaiah is talking about the people of God in Isaiah chapter 43, he names 3 complaints that God has against his people. Complaint number 1, thou hast not called upon me. See, that's what he's saying here. Call upon me in the day of trouble. And his second complaint was, thou hast not offered thy sacrifices, which he means sacrifices of praise. And he says, in the third place, you have made me to serve with your sins. That is, it's been my purpose to do my work on earth through human beings. And if I'm going to do that, I have to do it with dirty vessels, because you won't be righteous. And these are the complaints that he made. There's a whole psalm about this matter of offering God the sacrifice of thanksgiving and calling upon him. It's the 116th psalm. We might look at it just a moment. It's going to be quite a while, I suppose, before we get there. But you might want to read it in the meantime. Psalm 116, verse 2, because he hath inclined his ear to me, therefore I will call upon him as long as I live. Well, this is what wells out of a heart that wants to do what God wants him to do. Verse 4, then called I upon the name of the Lord. Verse 13, I will take the cup of salvation, I will call upon the name of the Lord. In verse 17, I will offer to thee the sacrifice of thanksgiving, and will call upon the name of the Lord. A fourfold statement the psalmist makes, that he will call upon the name of the Lord, and he will offer the sacrifice of thanksgiving. Of course, this is what Jonah said he would do when he finally got straightened out. I will offer the sacrifice of thanksgiving. And this is what we're told to do in Hebrews chapter 13, to offer the fruit of our lips, thanks unto our God. So that's what I'm asking for, to be thankful for what you've received and to call upon me when you need something. Now that ought to be fairly simple, hadn't it? Because that's my desire. A thankful heart and a heart that will call upon his God. Now verse 16. But unto the wicked, God says, this is the part now that has to do with your relationship with your fellow human being. But unto the wicked, God saith, what hast thou to do to declare my statutes, or that thou shouldest take my covenant in thy mouth, seeing thou hatest thy instruction? Since thou hatest instruction, and castest my word behind thee. In other words, why are you making out as though you're trying to please me? Now here's what you're actually doing. Verse 18. When thou sawest the thief, then thou consentest with him, and hast been partaker of the adulterers. He says, if you knew a thief stole something and you could buy what he stole real cheap, you knew he stole it, but that didn't bother you. In other words, to receive stolen goods. He says, you knew that here's somebody that is violating God's law of marriage. He's an adulterer, and you're a big buddy with him. And you feel good because you say, well, I don't do that, and he does, so that makes me good, you know. And you like to be around him because you know he's a dirty old sinner, and it makes you feel good. Because, well, you're taking pleasure in what he's doing. You're getting benefit out of his sin. This is an accusation that Paul made when he's writing to Timothy of some of the ones that were around. Verse 19. Thou givest thy mouth to evil, and thy tongue frameth deceit. Thou sittest and speakest against thy brother, thou slanderest thine own mother's son. These things thou hast done, and I kept silent. God, see, God speaking. He says, look, I've kept silent. This is the riddle. But the psalmist says, our God shall come and shall not keep silent. See, that's in verse 3. In verse 21, these things hast thou done, and I kept silent, God says. The psalmist says, well, he's going to come and he's not going to keep silent. He's going to come in judgment. These things thou hast done, and I kept silent. Thou thoughtest that I was altogether such a one as thyself, but I will reprove thee and set them in order before thine eyes. Now consider this, ye who forget God, lest I tear you in pieces, and there be none to deliver. Whosoever offers praise glorifies me, and to him that endures his conversation aright will I show the salvation of God. So in one psalm tonight, the psalmist has given us the right perspective concerning those who trust in wealth and concerning those who trust in God, regardless of how bad off they seem to be here. And in the other psalm, he assures us that God will come in judgment because people are involved in these things, which are all summed up in worshiping by form instead of heart. Now, you stop and think about it. If you were to look up religion in an encyclopedia, it would tell you that approximately 10% of the world's population is Christian. Well, if you took that 10%, which is nominally Christian, I'll assure you that at least 90% of that 10, and maybe more than that, are Christians only through some type of form. They're doing just exactly what God is condemning here and what God says he will judge. They have a form that they go through. Paul said, a form of godliness. And then he condemns that, which is really a heart violation of the first tablet. And then he condemns this piousness when really the heart's not right towards your fellow human being. And that has to do with the second tablet. Now, our next psalm is Psalm 51, and we've already considered that, if you remember. When we did Psalm 6, we did a series of psalms which included Psalm 51. It was Psalm 38, Psalm 6, Psalm 51, and Psalm 32 were all in the series. So we'll be looking at 52. Now, 53 we did when we did 14. Isn't that the same as 14? Isn't that the one that's the same as Psalm 14? And we've also already done 54 in another series with 7. We did 54, 57, and 7. So I believe I'll have to look into it, but I believe we have Psalm 52 to do. And then we'll be skipping over to Psalm 55. We'll be omitting some here that we've already done. So maybe we'll progress along a little more rapidly for a while here. You know, when you read them, if you don't stop and think through them, they seem to be so similar, don't they, the Psalms? And yet when you analyze them, they're all different, aren't they? Well, we'll close in prayer, thanking the Lord for His Word. Father, again we thank Thee for this opportunity to delve into Your Word, and we thank You for these who come to hear and to consider what You've said. We thank You for everyone who's interested in how You think and what You want to say to us. We thank You in Jesus' name. Amen.